last time I checked, this was the United States of America, not the United States of North Korea.
Radio Free Innsmouth, episode 358. So something like 4.5 years ago, on episode 134, I covered the band Bilskirnir in my own inimitable style. And by that I mean I took the cover of their third album, Votansfolk, changed the two swords on the cover and a couple of twice glow sticks, changed the golden bow laid across said swords into a tasty plate of jockball, which, as we all are no doubt aware, is Momo from Twice's favorite food.
Made in Japan.
But more importantly than that, I also managed to make a decent amount of Bilskirnir enthusiasts pretty darn mad. Maybe not full-on black police chief from an 80s action movie angry. But there was a decent amount of pushback along the lines of, what do you mean in flames of purification and activismus de Glaubens are as good as Wotan's Volk and Wotan Reed de Vivius? What kind of poser crap is this? Now don't worry, I've since come to the conclusion that every Bilskirnir release is a masterpiece in its own right, and they're all very much worth your time. But I still think that the third and fourth Bilskirnir albums are better than the first and second ones.
그러니까 엄마 아빠가 그거를 해주면 이게 하드렌즈니까.
No, I'm not doing this Bilskirnir Revisited episode just to tell people that. In the 4.5 years that have elapsed since I put that episode out, I've managed to familiarize myself with two Bilskirnir releases I hadn't heard at the time that are both of unusually good quality. And when you're talking about an all-around classic band like Bilskirnir, literally one of the best modern black metal bands, that should tell you something about how good these two releases are. We're talking about the 2005 Hyperborea EP and the 2018 In Solitary Silence EP. I didn't even know these releases existed at the time I did that Bilskirnir episode. And I gotta say, if you're into Bilskirnir, you haven't heard these, or if you're into black metal in general and you haven't heard these releases, you're missing out. And I'm gonna explain why over the course of this episode. First up, the Hyperborea EP. Over the course of 3 songs, it covers the whole wide variety of sounds you're gonna hear from Bilskirnir. You've got some dark, epic, melancholic type stuff. The more small-minded amongst you of the black metal listenership might be tempted to write off Bilskirnir as a rather shameless Burzum clone. But I think that's a pretty unfair and simplistic assessment of the kind of stuff that Vidar writes. I mean, yeah, obviously, there is a Burzum influence there, just like there is with most post-90s black metal of consequence. But he's got his own style in the way that he crafts and layers melodies, and a lot of it has to do with the influences he brings from outside of the Burzum sphere. Specifically, this is the only black metal band I can think of from the
Nobody knows who stole the chicken.
side of the political divide that went out of their way to cover a Catatonia song. And you can hear that in his guitar technique. It's less of a swift buzzing tremolo pick and more of a gently percussive strobing up and down motion. You also get the inclusion of very melancholic but not necessarily depressive harmonies and the guitars like you're hearing right now. This is a pretty uniquely Bilskirnir-styled take on an almost Satyricon-ish melody. So overall, I'd say Bilskirnir is less of a clone of the 90s black metal sound and more of an interesting outgrowth and development from it that does a great job of supplementing that sort of droning Burzumic black metal with outside influences without losing the spiritual core of that sort of music. And that's just on the opening track of the EP. As the runtime progresses, you start hearing hints of the more triumphant direction he would take 2 years later on the third Bilskirnir full-length Votansfolk. This is when the music starts to get really bouncy and groove-oriented while still maintaining that sort of Burzumic ambient mode of song composition. Right here, you can hear these interesting looping cyclical guitar arpeggios kind of vying for space with that harsh, static-throated scream. This heavily melodic, almost somewhat pop-oriented mode of guitar playing would become a major feature for Bilskirnir going forward, and it contributes heavily to the emotionality of this release. As you're hearing right now, really emotional, not necessarily evil black metal type stuff, but it's also not too terribly goofy either, at least to my ears. It's not overly sad or sappy, but it's not overly bouncy or happy sounding either. It just sounds very prideful and triumphant, but still wistfully nostalgic, in a very appealing and uniquely Bilskirnir sort of way. And it would seem to be building to an effective wrap-up of the song.
But wait! There's more! Call in the next 20 minutes and we'll supersize your
Black metal.
from a 2.5 pound tub to a whopping 6-pound bucket.
I love that fake out false ending because I like this song, and I'm glad there's more of it than you might initially have thought there was. Nice little double time trick there with the drums at the end as well. High quality stuff. Third song on this album goes to a different place, a slightly more hostile take on the Bilskirnir sound, while still maintaining that sort of triumphant atmosphere. This song, Autumn Fires, in particular, gives me a bit of a Judas Iscariot vibe, like with this droning chord. No, I'm not sure if Bilskirnir was influenced by Judas Iscariot or not. I think it's more likely that both of them were highly influenced by Burzum and decided to take that sound in a new direction. Speaking of which, this is downright evil sounding, particularly for Bilskirnir. Cyclic tremolo riff right here. Nice minor key arpeggio. A lot more abrasive and evil sounding than Bilskirnir usually ends up being. But it's a nice riff, as is this follow-up right here. Very stompy, evil, but still very positive and triumphant sort of riff. Perhaps showing up a bit of Bathory influence. Which, of course, would not be unexpected for Bilskirnir. I mean, this guy probably has Blood, Fire, Death memorized back to front. That whole Hyperborea EP from 2005. Really cool stuff. Sort of functions as a bridge between their earlier Raw albums and the sound they ended up going with on Wotan's Folk and especially Wotan Revisited. Speaking of which, the second EP, technically the most recent Bilskirnir release, because it came out in 2018, but according to the man behind Bilskirnir himself, it was actually recorded in 2009, and he considers it to be a bridge between the Wotan's Folk and Wotan Revisited albums. In Solitary Silence, much like its older brother Hyperborea, this one shows off a wide variety of what Bilskirnir is capable of, because you've got this real epic droning dark stuff. Like on the first full song on the EP, Home, really just dark, deep, cavernous sort of black metal. Also an interesting utilization of keyboards, not something you really think of Bilskirnir for. This slightly mocking riff here actually reminds me quite a bit of early Satyricon, but with a bit more thought put into how the different riffs lead into each other. Maybe some diabolical full moon mysticism era Immortal in there as well. But it's just really cool to hear Bilskirnir experiment with this more evil sounding stuff. Like right here when he changes up the chords a bit, very subtle. But appropriately evil sounding.
It is evil. Man, it is so evil. I think it's great because it's so bad.
And yet when we get to this set of riffs, it takes that evil feeling and morphs into something more melancholic. Still keeping the same basic melodic skeleton, but slightly nudging the emotions in a more depressive kind of direction. Bilskirnir, band big on emotion, and both the Hyperborea EP and the In Solitary Silence EP are absolutely essential if you're into Bilskirnir, or as I said earlier, black metal in general.
부리동나리 실세는 바로
Oh no, you're not getting out of that this easy. We're still revisiting Bilskirnir, because in those intervening 4.5 years since I did the prior Bilskirnir episode, I also got into a couple of Bilskirnir side projects, which if you're into Bilskirnir, or you're into black metal, or if you're just kind of into interesting metal stuff, are very much worth your time as well. First of these, Ulfhethnar. From what I can tell, they're kind of on hold at the moment, but Vidar was definitely doing some cool stuff with them back when they were still active. And they put out a really solid full-length album in 2005 called Von Deutsche Art. Normally, I'm more of a CD collector than a vinyl guy, but I gotta say, I definitely prefer the cover of the vinyl version of this album to the initial CD release. I don't really know what they were thinking with this album's original cover, but
That's a penis.
that said, quite a few on the songs are definitely gonna give you a boner if you're a fan of absurd. This is definitely the happiest sounding thing the Bilskirnir guy was ever involved with, and it's way more of a rack album than a black metal one. Rigidly rhythmic vocal patterns, major key riffing, and some really well done kind of peppy sounding bass. Also check out the fucking tom on these drums here. Real wacky sound to it. But even on the egregiously happy songs like this one, as the sound kind of opens up a little bit, you start to hear more and more of that Bilskirnir peculiar melodic soul. And then we're into a breakdown of sorts at least. Like I said earlier, definitely more of a rack album than a black metal one, but one that I feel should hold some appeal for black metal fans. It's got just enough of an aggressive edge and a lurking hint of darkness behind the sunshine to definitely entice the Bilskirnir listenership. Being that it is a Rack album, they've also got some more ballad-style songs on it. And if that ain't an absurd-style nasally guitar lead, I don't know what is. Going on over these jangly, melancholic, vaguely popish chords, total Rack stuff. Particularly once the vocals kick in.
Dem Wechsel je entbunden, früh deinen Wegen traf.
Which is to be expected because, again, as I've said for the millionth time, this is a fucking Rack album. But it's one with the Bilskirnir guy on it. Which means you're going to get a lot of musically interesting stuff like this counterpoint section here, sort of hearkening back to the lead guitar bit that opens the song up, now supplemented not only with the jangly guitars, but that more ringing kind of clean guitar using the neck pickup. But where this album really should hold some appeal for Bilskirnir fans, and just fans of inventive metal in general, is on the darker songs. Like this one right here, Neue Weltordnung, which features classic Bilskirnir-styled layered guitar and a gradual opening up of the song's structure. Absolutely genius stuff. From there, it takes even more of an unexpected turn, bringing in sort of a bouncy combination of hard punk and hard rock, with a rather bluesy, folksy sounding solo. From there, the morphic structure just keeps changing, this time moving into another new genre space of an angry, primitive sort of thrash metal almost. Real nasty sounding vocals. This album ain't all hard rock, it's still got plenty of metal edge to it. Also, check this part out. Bringing back that cyclical, repetitive melodic style from earlier in the song, now given a darker cast, both in the context of the thrashier parts that came right before it, as well as the darker rhythm guitar riffs underneath it. Ulfhethnar, absolutely outstanding. And that's not even the only super cool Bilskirnir side band, because we've also got Ødelegger, whom I briefly mentioned on the Children of Ildjarn episode. I told you I had something special planned for them.
I told you!
As far as more inventive takes on Ildjarn go, my favorite band of that style is probably going to be Crest, that I also covered on that Children of Ildjarn episode. But if we're just talking straight up Ildjarn worship bands, Ødelegger's got to be the best out of all of them. Like, honestly, the 3 Ødelegger albums, if you're into Ildjarn, you could put these on in between Ildjarn albums and be totally satisfied. He absolutely nails the sound. Whether it be the straight up hyper-aggressive, hyper-primitive sort of black metal that Ildjarn was so good at, particularly the second Ødelegger album, The Titan's Tomb, really goes hard on that style. I mean, even the vocals, you could still tell it's the Bilskirnir guy, but he's definitely doing a good job with the Ildjarn style of vocalization, as well as the Ildjarn style of simple yet cosmically significant counterpoint with a follow-up riff section like this bouncing off of that main intro riff. So he's got that part of Ildjarn down. He also takes on the more obscure aspects of Ildjarn, like the weirdo tracks without any percussion. This sort of thing was big on Ildjarn demos, as well as the collaborative efforts he had going with Nidhogg, and the Bilskirnir guy absolutely nails this style as well, particularly in regards to the super heavy bass guitar tone. Very hostile sounding stuff. But if you remember from the Ildjarn episode, that fellow was also big on utilizing synthesizer for more ambient tracks. Ødelegger does that too. Though in the case of Ødelegger, his synth tracks are a little bit closer to the more furtive and dark kind of stuff you would hear on Ildjarn's side project Sort Vokter than the majestic kind of meditative things you'd hear on an album like Ildjarn's Landscapes. Definitely nails the sort of naturally hostile, amoral vibe that both Ildjarn and Ødelegger were shooting for. But perhaps the most interesting Ødelegger tracks are ones where you can tell they might have started out as Bilskirnir riffs, and then he decided to reinterpret them in this more Ildjarn influenced style. Like that right there, that's definitely an Ulfhethnar Bilskirnir style riff. But it's been Ødeleggered up to become more abrasive, binary, and simplistic. Very interesting reinterpretation of Bilskirnir's sound through a more Ildjarn-tinted lens, particularly once we get to the counterpoint riffs to that main bit, where the melodies take on a much more primitive and abrasive quality while still maintaining that central melodic skeleton that started the song out. Very cool sort of song. And much like Ildjarn, with songs like Death Dynamics, there's also Ødelegger songs that are a bit more fun sounding, for lack of a better description. They're a little bit more in line with just a heavily primitive and punk influenced take on early Norwegian black metal. That's some proper raw Nordic sounding shit. Also some real wacky vocals. There's a bit more vocal variation to Ødelegger than there is in Bilskirnir. He tries out different approaches on almost every song, and they hit more often than they miss. Ødelegger's fucking outstanding. Ulfhethnar, super interesting, great stuff as well. And of course, Bilskirnir, absolutely essential black metal. Hopefully I don't need to convince you of that, but if you weren't already aware, maybe this episode helped out. That's about all I got to say. Until next time.
Take a fucking hurry. Jump in a fucking lake, not in a goddamn fire. Go and pound fucking salt. You crawling guys. You crawling there. You crawling guys.